How old is the universe?
Let me check on that. It looks like the answer is about 14 billion Julian years.
Okay, there's our answer. I come from a very religious family, which means I was raised to believe a literal interpretation of the Old Testament, where the universe was created in 6 days, Moses parted the Red Sea, and Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of a whale and lived to talk about it. Trouble is, I also grew up loving science. And in science, you have to have evidence to substantiate your claims. You can't just take them on faith. For a long time, I thought that, all right, it's going to be science or Judaism. It can never be both.
The reason why it's so hard to reconcile science and religion sometimes is because you have to go really deep.
I think some of those conflicts may not get resolved in our lifetime.
The war between science and religion.
Science versus God?
You don't seem to need a God to create a universe.
Scientists do need God.
Science versus religion. Let the opening statements commence.
I've often felt my religious and scientific sides to be at odds with one another. And looking around America today, it's not difficult to see conflict between science and religion. Why that is, or even if that is, depends on who you ask. My friend Bethany, for example, who was raised Christian and is a chemistry major like me, has no idea what I'm talking about.
As far as like creation and things like that, I could easily see God starting the world with a big bang. If scientifically that makes sense, I think it would fit with the Bible. I think that some people have a more rigid view of things than I do, and sometimes they're not as cool with the science and the religion working together.
Apparently, most scientists aren't cool with it. In 2009, the Pew Research Center interviewed members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science about their religious views. They found almost half of those interviewed did not identify as religious, compared to only 17% of the general population. Why might that be?
If you had pressed me even going back to middle school days about some of the strict things the Bible said about the creatures that populate the earth and Noah's Ark, I would have told you that's crap.
That's John Finnerty, a professor of biology. Finnerty was raised Catholic, but he was never able to reconcile the worldview he learned from science with the worldview of the church.
It became crystal clear to me that science and religion were largely in conflict intellectually when you think about faith. And so I know in the Catholic Church, faith is extolled as the greatest virtue. So belief in something in the complete absence of evidence. Belief in something in the complete absence of evidence is a grave mortal sin to a scientist. I mean, you cannot do that.
Faith is not the absence of questions, it's dealing with questions and still believing.
That's Binyomin Abrams, my academic advisor. Unlike Dr. Finnerty, he doesn't see a conflict between faith and his science.
One of the things I love about teaching chemistry is that for the most part, you really can't see it. You can't see what's going on. Macroscopically, you can, like color changes, gas evolution is great. But I'm talking about the really small stuff, like the quantum stuff. We can get all sorts of indirect information that lets us try to understand it.
You can never prove a mechanism.
But you can't prove a mechanism. You can't see it. If you don't see a parallel with that in Judaism, right, that's all Judaism is. It's all about looking at, well, there's something deeper there.
It's actually not that surprising that neither Bethany nor Dr. Abrams really see a conflict between religion and science. That same Pew survey found that scientists in the field of chemistry were the most likely to be religious. I also study chemistry, but I feel that conflict every time I step into the lab. I try to explain this to Bethany. The biggest conflict would be when people interpret the Bible, or for me it would be the Old Testament, right?
Right, the
Torah. Literally. And there are certain literal interpretations that outright conflict with what we know about physics. For example, miracles.
Behold his mighty hand!
How can someone who understands the principles of science accept the idea of miracles, which by definition defy the laws of nature? I brought that question to Mohammed Zaman, a professor of biomedical engineering and a practicing Muslim.
I think it's always going to be there in terms of miracles and how we interpret them. Mm-hmm. You have to reconcile them in many ways as a person of faith, and that reconciliation may not be literal. For me, it's more about the meaning. It's the message, whether it is the story of Moses or the story of Abraham or anybody else. I think it's the value that they present as opposed to the miracle itself. Because religion is not just about miracles. It's also about values. It's also about doing the right thing.
I get that, I do. In fact, that stuff, the non-miraculous stuff, is why I love my religion. Coming to school here, the biggest comfort that I've had is the Jewish community. It's made me feel safe. Having this kind of home away from home it's been really important, and I don't ever want to lose that. But it can be hard feeling like you're 100% a part of something when you can't participate in all the conversations. You're always holding back a little. I've always had a problem with the spirituality component of the religion. I'm just not wired that way.
Yeah, I think I've sort of come to a similar place. I almost feel like some of the beliefs that are held about spiritual questions become a real impediment to things that the community as a whole might want to do. One of the things in the Catholic faith as I was brought up, something that's just too much thinking about the afterlife, right? So if you're concerned mainly about the afterlife, well, maybe you can suffer some serious problems here and not necessarily do anything about them. And so it gets in the way a lot of times of effective community action against problems that we actually have the power to solve.
Dr. Zaman, on the other hand, sees his faith as a call to action, not an impediment to it.
It's more about trying to find things that are in need of help, and my faith allows me to do that. Sometimes it means taking on problems which affect poorest of the poor, even though there is no funding for that. But most importantly, Jeremy, I don't see myself as being 10% scientist and 10% religious and 10% this. I think this amalgam of various values that I have are all coming together because of this integration of religion and science.
The integration of religion and science. This is what I feel like I'm missing. I want them to work together. I want to be able to apply a critical thinking lens to Judaism, to science. I also want to bring some of that comfort to the scientific world. Science doesn't have to be cut and dry. I get very emotional about my experiments. I get very excited when they work out, and I'm distraught when they don't work. These are two really important things to me, and I want them to work in unison.
You know, just like you pray the morning prayers in the morning, the evening prayers in the evening, you do your science in the science lab and not in the synagogue. But it doesn't mean you leave your belief in something greater than you, your excitement for and passion for Judaism in the synagogue. It just means that looks differently in the science lab.
I think it's coming to terms with that conflict. It's perfectly fine to have conflict. I mean, a little bit of conflict is actually important to create a sense of creativity. And for me, for example, Jeremy, it's an opportunity to learn more on both directions. But as long as you're doing that with the right intention, right? So you have to tell yourself that I'm doing it not because I want to prove one over the other, but I'm genuinely curious. I'm going to be open-minded about it. Then I think you'll find it to be more exhilarating than troubling.
So maybe reconciling science and religion isn't the point. I wanted to find a way for religion and science to work together. Maybe this is how they work together. Here you have two very different ways of being curious and asking questions about the world. And because you can't reconcile them, it keeps you curious, keeps you asking questions. Maybe that's a good thing.
Personally, I'm not convinced there's a resolution out there to this conflict that I feel. But if there is, I'll believe it when I see it.